Sharks have been roaming the oceans for over 400 million years, evolving into some of the most efficient predators on the planet. Many don't realize that species like the bull shark can thrive in salt and freshwater, making them even more dangerous near river mouths. The great white's legendary attacks are often a result of curiosity, while tiger sharks, known as the garbage cans of the sea, will eat almost anything they come across. But what happens when these predators get too close? Discover the 6 most intense shark encounters that will change how you see the ocean. The sun dipped toward the horizon on August 17, 2001, casting long shadows across the Pacific. The USS Faulkner, a Coast Guard cutter, sailed through the remote waters off California's Perdition Bay, a place notorious for its dense great white shark population. The crew aboard the Faulkner had heard the stories. Fishermen and locals alike told tales of enormous sharks that seemed almost intelligent, stalking vessels that dared to venture into their territory. Yet for Captain Neil Kingsley, this was routine. He had spent his career patrolling dangerous waters and facing all manner of threats from the sea. The stories to him were just that, stories. Perdition Bay had earned its reputation not just for the number of sharks, but for their size and aggression. Marine biologists had long been puzzled by the sharks' behavior in this region, noting their unusual proximity to the coastline and unpredictable patterns. The bay's geography, marked by underwater canyons and shifting currents, created an ideal hunting ground for these apex predators. The deeper waters further offshore were teeming with life, from seals to massive schools of fish, but something in the ecosystem was unbalanced. Kingsley thought little of this as he navigated the ship through the calm evening waters. Below deck, Lieutenant Amanda Bowers was reviewing recent radar data. The young officer was meticulous in her work, combing through readings that tracked marine life movements. The waters here fascinated her. The sharks were larger and more aggressive than in other regions. She knew from recent studies that environmental changes had been affecting marine ecosystems, possibly explaining the increased aggression of these great whites. There had been a series of reports about rising sea temperatures and declining fish populations due to overfishing, but nothing had conclusively linked these changes to the shark's behavior. Chief Petty Officer Dale Tucker worked nearby, ensuring the vessel was in good condition. He had been in the Coast Guard for decades and believed that simple, primal urges drove animals. Tucker respected the sea but saw it in practical terms. Sharks were dangerous, but they were just predators. He had heard the recent rumors of increased shark attacks in the bay but dismissed them as isolated incidents. He didn't worry too much about the cause, focusing instead on his duties to keep the ship and crew safe. The USS Faulkner continued its patrol as dusk settled in. The crew, accustomed to the rhythms of life at sea, went about their tasks with little concern for what lurked below. Perdition Bay seemed still, the darkening sky reflected in the waters, which remained unnervingly calm. The crew carried on, thinking of nothing more than another routine night. But something stirred beneath the surface. Unbeknownst to the crew, a massive great white shark had been tracking the ship for miles. Its massive form moved silently through the depths, far larger than any shark recorded in the area. It had become unusually aggressive in recent weeks, possibly driven by environmental disturbances in the region. Warmer waters, the depletion of prey, and human interference had triggered something primal and violent within this creature. And now it had found a new target in the USS Faulkner. Without warning, the shark struck. The first impact was a sudden, violent jolt against the ship's hull, strong enough to send a shudder through the entire vessel. The crew scrambled as the ship tilted precariously, the unexpected force nearly knocking some of them off their feet. The hull groaned under the pressure, and water began to slosh over the decks. The shark, massive and powerful, had launched itself at the ship with incredible force, treating it like prey. The crew below deck rushed to assess the damage, panic spreading as water seeped into the lower compartments. Amanda, her mind racing, knew they had to contain the flooding immediately. The shark's aggression was unlike anything she had ever seen, far beyond the behavior of a typical predator. This wasn't a simple act of instinct. There was something deliberate, almost calculated, in the way the shark attacked. She recalled the environmental data she had studied earlier. Climate change has been shifting ocean temperatures, disrupting feeding patterns and causing unpredictable movements among marine species. Perhaps the shark had been pushed to this extreme by forces it didn't understand, but it didn't make the situation any less dire. Above deck, the shark breached the water again, its massive body slamming into the hull with terrifying precision. The crew, though trained for emergencies, was unprepared for an assault of this magnitude. The great white's thick skin scraped against the steel as it breached partially onto the deck, its teeth snapping at the railings and tearing away chunks of metal and wood. The ship creaked dangerously under the weight as the crew struggled to keep balance on the tilting deck. Equipment scattered across the floor, and attempts to stabilize the ship became frantic. The shark slid back into the water, but its attacks didn't cease. It circled the ship, its dorsal fin slicing through the water like a dark blade, preparing for another strike. The crew worked desperately to patch the breaches and pump out the water that had flooded the lower decks. The damage was extensive and time was running out. The shark attacked again, its body ramming the hull with such force that the ship lurched violently, more water rushing in with each successive blow. Amanda moved quickly, directing others as they attempted to reinforce the hull. In the back of her mind, she pieced together the cause of this unusual aggression. Environmental changes had altered the delicate balance of life in the bay, displacing sharks and diminishing their food sources. Human activity, overfishing, pollution, climate shifts, had driven the shark to behave with violence that defied its usual patterns. But knowing the cause provided little comfort in the moment. The shark had made them its target, and there was no time to dwell on the why. Another hit. The shark struck from beneath the ship, this time causing part of the hull to cave inward. More water gushed in faster than the crew could pump it out. Desperation set in as they worked feverishly to slow the flooding. Equipment slid across the decks as the ship tilted dangerously on the verge of capsizing. The vessel's structural integrity was failing, and they all knew that if the shark continued its assault, they wouldn't be able to stay afloat much longer. As the crew fought to hold the ship together, the great white returned for another attack. It breached the water once more, its enormous jaws closing around the legs of Chief Tucker, who had been working near the edge of the deck. The shark's teeth sliced through his flesh with brutal efficiency, pulling him into the sea in a cloud of blood. Tucker disappeared beneath the surface before anyone could react, his final moments lost to the depths. The rest of the crew, horrified and shaken, continued their desperate efforts to repair the ship. The water was rising rapidly, and the reality of their situation was becoming inescapable. The ship was sinking, and the shark showed no signs of relenting. Kingsley ordered a distress signal to be sent, though he knew help was far away. The ship limped toward the coastline, barely holding together as the great white circled beneath the waves, watching, waiting for the final blow. The crew continued to fight against the water pouring into the lower decks, trying to patch leaks and pump out the sea. But the shark's relentless attacks had taken their toll. The realization settled over them all. Their presence in the bay had triggered something in the great white. Whether it was the result of environmental disturbances or simple territorial aggression, they had become the focus of its wrath. The ocean was no longer just a vast, indifferent force. It had become hostile, driven by forces humans had tampered with for too long. In the end, the ship barely made it back toward the lights of Perdition Bay. The shark had disappeared, its attack over, but its shadow lingered in the minds of the survivors. They had come face to face with the consequences of their actions. Nature fighting back, unpredictable and deadly. As they limped back to shore, the sea's eerie calm returned, but they knew that it had changed forever. On April 12, 2003, deep in the waters off the Bahamas, a seasoned diver named Victor Landry prepared for another routine day of cage diving. He had traveled to the small remote island of Silver Key, a hidden gem in the Bahamas that few outsiders knew about. It was a prime spot for divers, renowned for its clear waters, and more importantly, its sharks. The Bahamas had always been famous for its diverse shark population. Reef sharks, nurse sharks, hammerheads. But here at Silver Key, tiger sharks ruled. Victor had been diving into these waters for years. He was a well-known figure in the shark diving community, respected for his calm demeanor and extensive experience. He loved the adrenaline of the dive, the thrill of being inches away from one of nature's most powerful predators. protected only by the thin metal bars of a cage. To him, the danger was controlled, familiar. Tiger sharks were fierce but predictable. Territorial, yes, but they usually circled warily, only striking if provoked or threatened. That morning, as Victor boarded the boat with the crew, everything seemed routine. The sun rose steadily, and the boat hummed as it cut through the gentle waters. Victor readied his gear and went over the safety protocols with the small team of divers who had joined him. They would lower the cage into the water, descend to a modest depth, and wait. The sharks would come, as they always did, drawn by the scent of the bait the crew prepared. It was a dance Victor knew well, and though the others might feel the rush of fear, for him, it was like coming home. The boat anchored in a known tiger shark territory, a spot where the sharks often fed on sea turtles and fish. The water was unusually calm. Victor suited up, feeling the familiar weight of the wetsuit and tank. The cage was lowered, its rusted metal bars clinking as it sank into the blue depths. He took a deep breath, checking his air supply one last time before stepping into the cage. The cold water closed around him, and the world above disappeared. As expected, it wasn't long before the first shark appeared. A shadow moved beneath the boat, and Victor's pulse quickened as a large tiger shark swam into view. Its distinctive striped pattern made it unmistakable. At about 12 feet long, the shark moved with slow, deliberate grace, its eyes black and expressionless. It circled the cage from a distance at first, eyeing the bait but showing little interest in the divers. Victor watched it, feeling the familiar thrill. The other divers remained tense, clutching the bars of the cage as the shark passed close by. But this one was acting differently. Even Victor could sense that. Instead of lazily drifting past the cage and disappearing into the deep, it returned, circling tighter and tighter. There was something off about its movements, more focused, less curious, and more determined. The shark made a sudden turn, accelerating toward the cage. It rammed its snout against the bars with surprising force, causing the metal to shudder. Victor braced himself, gripping the sides of the cage, trying to steady himself. This wasn't the first time he had encountered an aggressive shark, but the power of the hit was more intense than he expected. The tiger shark wasn't simply testing the cage. It seemed intent on breaking through. The second hit was harder. Victor's heart pounded in his chest as the cage shook violently. The bolts securing the cage to the boat creaked under the pressure. The other divers were beginning to panic, their eyes wide behind their masks. Victor tried to keep his breathing steady, but the situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. The tiger shark continued its assault, ramming the cage again and again, each hit harder than the last. A loud crack echoed through the water as one of the bars gave way under the relentless force. Victor's mind raced. He had never seen a shark behave like this before. It was so territorial and determined to get at the divers. The cage, which had always felt like a fortress, now seemed dangerously fragile. Then the unthinkable happened. With a final brutal hit, the shark broke through the weakened bars. Victor found himself face to face with the predator, the jagged metal twisted and open. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down. The shark hovered just outside the breach, its black eyes fixed on him. Victor's training kicked in, and he knew he had to act fast. He couldn't panic. Panicking meant death. The shark lunged forward, its powerful jaws snapping shut just inches from Victor's face. He kicked back, pressing himself against the rear of the cage, trying to stay as far from the gaping breach as possible. But the shark wasn't giving up. It pushed its snout through the opening, its teeth scraping against the metal. Victor kicked at the shark's head, desperate to keep it from getting inside. He felt the cage tip slightly as the shark forced more of its massive body into the opening. One of the divers was trying to climb out through the top of the cage, but the shark's thrashing knocked him back down. Victor could see the panic in the man's eyes as he struggled to stay away from the snapping jaws. The water was churning now, bubbles and debris clouding Victor's vision as the shark continued its attack. Victor knew he had only one option left. He grabbed a small emergency spear from the side of the cage, a last resort meant for moments like this. With the shark's head now fully inside the cage, Victor aimed for the soft area just behind the eye and struck. The spear connected, not deep enough to kill, but enough to cause the shark to recoil. The shark pulled back, thrashing in pain, and the force of its retreat sent the cage spinning. Victor held on tight as the cage swung wildly, banging against the side of the boat. The shark disappeared into the depths for a moment, but Victor knew it wasn't gone for good. The water around him was filled with the scent of blood and fear. The crew above scrambled to haul the cage back to the surface. The winch creaked under the weight, and the cage rose slowly through the water. Victor could see the boat getting closer, but he could also see the shark returning, circling beneath them, waiting for another chance. The final moments felt like an eternity. The shark surged upward once more, slamming into the cage with such force that it nearly knocked Victor off his feet. But this time the boat's crew managed to pull the cage free, lifting it out of the water just as the shark made its last lunge. The metal frame swung above the surface, dripping and damaged but intact enough to have saved them. As the cage was set down on the boat's deck, Victor collapsed inside, exhausted and shaking. His body ached from the struggle, and his mind reeled from the close call. The tiger shark circled below for a few minutes longer before finally disappearing into the depths, leaving only silence in its wake. Victor lay still, staring up at the sky. He had survived, but the line between adventure and death had never felt thinner. On August 23, 2005, Driftwood Beach, California was a popular surfing destination known for its reliable waves and laid-back atmosphere. That summer, however, surfers had noticed an increase in hammerhead shark sightings. The sharks were not typically a threat to humans, but their sudden presence close to shore was unsettling. Brandon Hale, a local surfer in his mid-20s, had been riding these waves for years. He was a regular at Driftwood, confident in the water, and had no fear of sharks despite the recent sightings. That morning, Brandon met up with his friends Colin, Leah, and Jesse for a typical day of surfing. The sky was clear and the waves were ideal for a long session. As they paddled out, the group joked and prepared to catch some waves, unaware of the danger lurking beneath them. Hammerhead sharks had been seen more frequently in this area over the past weeks. These sharks, with their unique, flat, hammer-shaped heads, typically stayed farther offshore, feeding on fish and smaller prey. Though not considered highly aggressive toward humans, their increased presence near the beach raised concerns. Fishermen had been reporting more sightings than usual, but no one could pinpoint the cause. Brandon paddled out to catch a wave, relaxing on his board while waiting for the next set. He noticed something unusual beneath him, a dark, fast-moving shadow under the water. Initially, he thought it was a fish, but as it passed closer, he recognized it as a large hammerhead shark. His heart raced. The shark wasn't just passing by, it began circling his board. The shark, about 10 feet long, was acting strangely. Normally, hammerheads didn't approach surfers so closely. This one seemed focused on him. Brandon's instincts told him to stay calm, but the shark's behavior made that difficult. It circled tighter, and then, without warning, it lunged at his board. The force of the hit knocked Brandon into the water. Disoriented, Brandon resurfaced, kicking hard to stay afloat. The hammerhead circled again, and Brandon knew this was more than a passing encounter. The shark struck again, ramming into his side, causing him to lose his grip on the board. Fear surged through him as he realized the shark was becoming increasingly aggressive. Hammerheads weren't known for attacking humans like this, and the realization that this was not normal behavior made the situation even more terrifying. The shark's next move was brutal. It lunged forward, its jaws closing around Brandon's leg. Pain shot through him as the shark's teeth dug deep into his flesh. He kicked at it desperately, trying to get free. After what felt like an eternity, the shark released him, but Brandon was left bleeding heavily, his leg mangled from the attack. Jesse, nearby on his board, saw the attack and rushed over to help. He grabbed Brandon's arm and pulled him back onto his board. Colin and Leah noticed the commotion and quickly paddled over to assist Brandon in getting out of the danger zone. The hammerhead shark remained in the water circling, but kept its distance as the group paddled furiously toward the shore. Reaching the beach, they dragged Brandon onto the sand, his leg a bloody mess. Colin rushed to call for help while Leah and Jesse tried to stop the bleeding as best they could. The attack had happened so quickly that it left them in shock. The sight of their friend's bloodied leg a stark reminder of the ocean's unpredictability. In the following days, they learned what might have caused the attack. Local fishermen revealed that illegal fishing operations had been disturbing the shark's natural habitat, reducing their food supply and driving them closer to shore. The hammerheads, deprived of their usual prey, had become more aggressive, leading to incidents like the one Brandon had experienced. Human activity had disrupted the ecosystem, and the consequences were becoming clear. On July 17, 2007, in the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico, off the coast of Louisiana, seasoned fisherman Arthur McNeil prepared for a day of deep-sea fishing. At 48, Arthur had spent most of his life navigating these waters. He was well acquainted with the dangers that lurked beneath the surface, especially the bull sharks that patrolled the Gulf's murky estuaries. Known for their aggressive nature, bull sharks were notorious for inhabiting both saltwater and freshwater, often venturing into the rivers and shallow bays where they hunted. That morning, Arthur had set out early from the small fishing town of Port Haven, his boat cutting through the calm waters as the sun began to rise. He had fished these waters countless times, often bringing back grouper, snapper, or sometimes even a big game fish. The Gulf had been his livelihood and his sanctuary for years, and he had grown to respect its wildness. There was always the potential for danger, but Arthur had grown comfortable and confident in his ability to handle whatever the sea threw his way. The day had started smoothly. By mid-morning, Arthur had already caught a decent haul, carefully storing the fish in his cooler as he enjoyed the steady rhythm of the ocean. The waters were calm, the boat bobbing slightly as he cast his line out again, hoping for one more big catch before heading back to shore. The Gulf seemed peaceful, but Arthur knew better than to let his guard down. Bull sharks were a common presence in these waters, especially during the warmer months. They were strong, adaptable predators that could thrive in a variety of environments. Despite their reputation for aggression, Arthur had never had a dangerous encounter with one, until that day. As he waited patiently for another bite, Arthur noticed a sudden shift in the water around his boat. The surface, once calm, began to churn slightly, and small fish scattered in every direction. He tightened his grip on the fishing rod, sensing something large beneath him. It wasn't unusual for larger predators to move through these waters, but there was an unmistakable tension in the air now. Suddenly, his fishing line jerked hard. He stood up, bracing himself as the line pulled taut. It felt heavy, stronger than any fish he had hooked that day. Excitement briefly flared in his chest as he began to reel it in, expecting a large fish. But within seconds, he knew something was wrong. The pull wasn't steady. It was erratic, aggressive, and powerful. The line whipped violently as whatever was on the other end thrashed beneath the surface. Arthur leaned forward, trying to maintain control, but the strength of the creature below was overwhelming. Then, without warning, a massive bull shark breached the surface. Its broad head and thick body were unmistakable, its gray skin cutting through the water as it thrashed violently. Arthur froze for a second, watching the shark with growing alarm. It wasn't just after his bait. The shark was coming for him. The bull shark surged forward, its powerful body slamming into the side of Arthur's boat with a force that nearly knocked him off his feet. The boat rocked dangerously, water splashing up as the shark continued its attack, ramming the hull again and again. Arthur tried to steady himself, grabbing the edge of the boat as the shark circled beneath him. He had never seen such aggressive behavior from a bull shark before, and the realization of how dire the situation was began to sink in. The shark wasn't backing off. It was relentless, circling the boat like a predator closing in on its prey. Arthur quickly cut the line, hoping to remove whatever had angered the shark, but it didn't stop. The bull shark charged again, this time hitting the boat with enough force to send a crack through the wooden hull. Arthur's heart raced as he watched the water begin to seep through the damaged section of the boat. He needed to act fast. Arthur scrambled to start the engine, hoping to steer the boat toward shallower waters, but the shark was faster. As he turned the key, the shark surged upward, its massive head crashing into the side of the boat, nearly flipping it over. Arthur was thrown backward, hitting the deck hard as the boat tipped precariously to one side. He could hear the engine sputter but failed to start as he lay there, disoriented and struggling to regain his footing. The shark struck again, its teeth scraping against the side of the boat, tearing into the wood with each pass. Arthur could see its dark eyes as it swam beneath the surface, circling back for another attack. His hands shook as he reached for a spear gun he kept on board for emergencies. He had never needed to use it in all his years of fishing, but now it was his only option. With the shark approaching once more, Arthur aimed the spear gun at its head, his breath coming in ragged gasps. As the bull shark charged again, Arthur fired. The spear hit its mark, piercing the shark's side. The creature thrashed violently, blood mixing with the water as it twisted in pain. For a moment it disappeared beneath the surface, and Arthur hoped it would be enough to drive the shark away. But the bull shark wasn't done. It returned, enraged, ramming the boat again with renewed force. The damage to the hull was severe now, and water was rushing faster than before. Arthur knew the boat wouldn't last much longer. He had to abandon it before the shark struck again. Grabbing a life jacket and securing himself to a small emergency raft, Arthur prepared to leave the sinking boat. He tossed the raft into the water, watching as it inflated, then climbed aboard, keeping his eyes on the water the entire time. The bull shark circled below, its movements slower now but still menacing. As Arthur drifted away from the sinking boat, he watched as the bull shark made one final pass before disappearing into the depths. The water was eerily calm again, but Arthur knew he had narrowly escaped a deadly encounter. The boat, his trusted companion for years, slowly sank beneath the surface, swallowed by the gulf. Hours later, he was found by a passing fishing vessel, exhausted but alive. The attack had shaken him deeply, a stark reminder of the power and unpredictability of the ocean's predators. The bull shark had been a force of nature, driven by instinct and hunger, but Arthur had survived by relying on his experience and quick thinking. Oliver Grant had a habit of challenging himself in ways that most would call reckless. On that particular morning, he had decided to take his kayak out into the waters off the coast of Exmouth, Western Australia. Known for its pristine beaches and proximity to the Ningaloo Reef, the area was also infamous for its shark population. Oliver knew this well, but was drawn to the ocean's call nonetheless. March 14, 2009, was supposed to be another day of pushing his limits, but nothing could have prepared him for what awaited beneath the surface that day. As the sun climbed higher into the sky, Oliver paddled further out into the open waters. His plan had been simple: spend a few hours exploring the coastline, navigating through the rocky outcrops, and enjoying the peace of being alone in the vast ocean. He had done it many times before, and always found it a perfect way to escape the pressures of everyday life. He was an experienced kayaker and understood the risks of paddling in shark territory. The area had a rich diversity of marine life, and sharks were a common sight, but they typically kept their distance from humans. Oliver wasn't afraid. He had a healthy respect for the ocean's predators, but had never felt threatened by them. It wasn't long into his paddle, however, before the water around him seemed to shift. He noticed a sudden absence of the usual small fish darting near the surface. The sea beneath him darkened, and Oliver felt the first stirrings of unease. He adjusted his position slightly, scanning the water for signs of movement. His pulse quickened when he saw the distinct dorsal fin of a shark cutting through the water nearby. At first it was just one fin, then another appeared, and then another. They were closing in, slowly and deliberately. Oliver's mind raced as he tried to assess the situation. He knew the waters around Exmouth were home to a variety of sharks, white-tips, tigers, even hammerheads. But it was the bull sharks he feared most. Bull sharks were known for their aggression and territorial behavior, especially in shallow coastal areas where they often hunted. As a kayaker, he was vulnerable, especially now, with several large sharks surrounding him. For a few tense moments, Oliver remained still, hoping the sharks would lose interest and move on. But that wasn't what happened. The largest of the group, a bull shark, made the first move. It circled closer, its body brushing against the bottom of his kayak. Oliver could feel the shark's presence beneath him, the immense power of its body vibrating through the thin hull. Another shark bumped the side of the kayak, hard enough to jolt him off balance. The sharks were testing him, nudging, waiting for a reaction. Oliver fought to stay calm, but the situation was quickly spiraling out of control. One of the bull sharks rammed the kayak again, this time with more force. The kayak rocked dangerously, and Oliver gripped his paddle tightly, trying to steady himself. The sharks seemed to sense his growing panic, their movements becoming more aggressive, circling closer with each pass. Without warning, one of the sharks struck the kayak head-on, nearly flipping it over. Oliver was thrown sideways, his body slamming into the water. Panic surged through him as he resurfaced, thrashing to grab hold of the overturned kayak. The sharks were still there, circling. He could see their dark shapes moving just beneath the surface, their dorsal fins cutting through the water as they closed in on him. One of the bull sharks charged again, its snout ramming into his side, sending pain shooting through his body. Desperate, Oliver pulled himself halfway onto the capsized kayak, his arms and legs flailing in the water. He could feel the cold rush of fear gripping him tighter than the sharks ever could. His mind raced for a solution. He had no weapon, no protection, just his instinct to survive. Another bump came and the kayak shifted again. Oliver's hand slipped and he fell back into the water. This time, one of the sharks lunged toward him, its jaws wide and teeth gleaming. He kicked out in a panic, striking the shark's head with his foot. The shark recoiled, but only briefly. The others continued circling, waiting for their chance to strike. With one final burst of adrenaline, Oliver managed to right the kayak and haul himself back on top. Blood from a cut on his arm mixed with the salt water, attracting the sharks even more. But now, with his body safely out of the water, he frantically paddled, trying to distance himself from the predators. Every muscle in his body burned with exertion, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but he knew he couldn't stop. The sharks followed for what felt like an eternity, occasionally nudging the kayak and testing its strength. Oliver kept paddling, driven by sheer survival instinct. Slowly, the dorsal fins began to disappear one by one, the sharks losing interest as he moved into shallower waters near the coastline. Oliver didn't stop until he was near the rocky shore, his kayak scraping against the sand as he collapsed onto solid ground, exhausted and shaking. In the aftermath, Oliver sat on the rocks, staring out at the ocean that had nearly claimed him. He couldn't shake the feeling that the sharks had been more than just curious. It was as if they had been displaced from their normal territory, driven closer to shore by forces he didn't yet understand. He thought about the increased fishing activity he had seen in the area, and the rumors of illegal practices disturbing the ecosystem. Perhaps the sharks were reacting to these disruptions, their instincts altered by human interference. Oliver knew one thing as he sat there, catching his breath. The ocean was unpredictable, and while it could be a place of peace and beauty, it also demanded respect. The bond between man and nature was fragile, and in those waters, the balance had shifted. That day, Oliver had survived, but he knew the sharks would always be out there, just beneath the surface, waiting. Dr. Clara Weston had spent her career studying the mysteries of the deep ocean. On September 8, 2006, she was aboard the research vessel Abyssal, stationed off the coast of New Zealand in the remote waters near the Kermadec Trench. This region, famous for its extreme depths, had always been a treasure trove of discoveries. The trench was one of the deepest in the world, and it was rumored to be home to creatures long thought extinct. Clara had always been fascinated by stories of ancient species, and she believed there were still undiscovered giants lurking in the abyss. That belief had brought her here on a solo mission to gather data about large predators in the area. She never imagined how close she would come to one. The day had begun like many others during her research trips. Long hours setting up equipment, logging data, and sending submersible drones deep into the trench to gather footage. The ocean had always been Clara's passion, and despite the isolation, she found peace in her work. She had been tracking several large sharks in the area for months, suspecting they were members of a rare species, possibly descendants of the ancient megalodon, the largest predatory shark to have ever lived. It was thought to be extinct, but Clara's recent findings suggested otherwise. Something massive was still out there. That morning, the ship's sonar had picked up an unusually large signal. Clara's heart raced as she prepared to send her submersible down once more. The footage from previous dives had shown massive shadows, indistinct forms that seemed to evade clear documentation. But today, the readings were stronger than ever, and Clara believed she might finally catch a glimpse of the creature that had eluded her for so long. As the submersible descended into the deep, Clara watched the live feed intently. The screen showed the dark, cold depths of the trench, punctuated occasionally by the flicker of bioluminescent creatures drifting in the water. Then, just as the submersible reached the lower depths, a shadow passed across the camera. It was enormous, larger than any known species of great white or even the biggest whale sharks. Her pulse quickened as the creature came into view. Its body was thick, muscular, and unmistakably shark-like, but it was larger than anything she had ever seen, resembling what could only be a close relative of the megalodon. Clara's excitement quickly turned to unease as the creature turned toward the submersible. The massive shark moved with purpose, its pale, scarred body reflecting the dim light from the vessel. It was clear that this was no ordinary shark. It was an ancient predator, something that had survived in the depths for millions of years. She stared at the screen, mesmerized by the sheer size of the animal. The submersible's instruments struggled to keep up with its movements, but it wasn't long before the creature was circling, curious or perhaps territorial. Suddenly, a violent jolt rocked the vessel. Clara grabbed onto the nearest railing as she struggled to maintain her balance. The creature had struck the submersible with incredible force. The impact sent shockwaves through the water, shaking the abyssal above. Clara frantically checked the submersible's controls, her heart pounding as she realized that the shark wasn't simply investigating. It was attacking. The shark rammed the submersible again, this time harder, its jaws snapping at the metal frame. Clara watched in horror as the creature bit down, tearing off a chunk of the submersible's outer casing. Alarms blared inside the vessel as water began to flood the lower compartments. Clara's fingers flew over the controls, desperately trying to recall the submersible before it was completely destroyed. But the shark wasn't done. Another strike hit, and this time the submersible's lights flickered, cutting off Clara's live feed. She was blind to what was happening below but could feel the vibrations through the hull of the ship. The shark was relentless, hammering the submersible with its massive body, determined to dismantle it piece by piece. Clara's stomach churned as she felt the pressure building. She was losing the vessel, and with it, the chance to document one of the greatest discoveries of her career. She knew she had to act fast. Ignoring the alarms and the chaos around her, Clara initiated the emergency ascent, forcing the damaged submersible to rise to the surface. She prayed the shark would lose interest as the depth lessened, but the creature seemed undeterred. For every meter the submersible gained, the shark followed, continuing its assault with terrifying precision. It was no longer just a predator. It was a force of nature, a remnant of an ancient world that refused to disappear quietly. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the submersible broke the surface. Clara rushed out onto the deck, her eyes scanning the water. The ocean was eerily calm, but she knew the shark was still out there, lurking beneath the waves. The damage to the submersible was extensive. Large sections of the outer hull had been torn away, exposing wires and damaged sensors. The shark had come closer to destroying it than Clara had ever imagined possible. As she stood on the deck, her hands trembling from the adrenaline, Clara reflected on the encounter. She had been so close to capturing definitive proof of the creature's existence, but instead she had come face to face with the brutal reality of the ocean's depths. This predator had survived for millions of years, adapting and thriving in the dark, untouched corners of the earth. Humans were merely visitors here, fragile and unprepared for the dangers that lurked below. The discovery Clara had been chasing for years was now confirmed, but it came at a cost. The ocean had revealed its secrets, but only briefly, reminding her of its power and the fine line between curiosity and danger.